The fluorescent lights of Murphy's Corner Diner buzzed and flickered overhead, casting an uneven glow across the worn linoleum floor that had seen better days decades ago. It was nearly 11:30 on a Tuesday night in the heart of Detroit, Michigan, where the autumn wind rattled the old single-pane windows and sent leaves swirling past the glass like tiny dancers in the streetlight's amber beam. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Inside the diner, the last remnants of the dinner rush had long since disappeared, leaving behind only the lingering aroma of fried onions, coffee grounds, and the industrial-strength cleaning solution that Carmen Rodriguez had been using to scrub down the red vinyl booths. Her dark hair was pulled back in a messy bun, secured with a rubber band she'd found behind the register, and her black uniform polo shirt bore the faint stains of a 12-hour shift that had tested every ounce of her patience. Carmen moved with the practiced efficiency of someone who had learned to maximize every motion, every step, every gesture to save precious energy for the tasks that mattered most. At 22 years old, she possessed the kind of quiet determination that came from shouldering responsibilities far beyond her years. Her hands, though young, showed the calluses and small cuts that spoke of countless hours spent carrying heavy plates, reaching into steaming dishwater, and navigating the chaos of a busy kitchen during the height of dinner service. The diner itself reflected the struggles of the neighborhood it served. The checkerboard floor tiles were cracked in several places, held together with electrical tape that had long since lost its stickiness. The red leather seats had been patched with mismatched vinyl, and the chrome on the counter stools had worn down to reveal the metal underneath. The jukebox in the corner hadn't worked in 3 years, but nobody had bothered to remove it because it gave the place character, according to the owner. Carmen's younger sister, Isabella, sat hunched over a worn paperback book in the corner booth, her 13-year-old frame swimming in an oversized hoodie that had once belonged to their older brother before he left for the military 2 years ago. Isabella's homework lay scattered across the table. Math problems she'd been struggling with for the past hour, a history report about the Civil War that was due tomorrow, and a permission slip for a field trip to the Science Museum that Carmen couldn't afford to sign. The girl's concentration was admirable, considering the circumstances. She'd learned to tune out the clatter of dishes, the hiss of the grill, and the occasional raised voice from the kitchen, where Murphy himself, a 60-year-old Irish man with a perpetual scowl, barked orders at the night cook. Isabella had been coming to the diner after school every day for the past 8 months, ever since their grandmother had suffered her second stroke and could no longer be trusted to watch over a teenage girl in their small apartment on the east side of the city. Carmen paused in her cleaning routine to glance at the old clock above the coffee machine. 11:37. She still had 23 minutes left on her shift, which meant wiping down the remaining 6 tables, restocking the sugar dispensers, refilling the salt and pepper shakers, sweeping the entire dining area, and helping close out the register. Her feet ached in the cheap canvas sneakers she'd bought at a discount store 3 weeks ago, already developing holes near the toes from the constant standing and walking on the unforgiving floor. The bell above the front door chimed softly as a gust of wind pushed against the glass, making Carmen look up from the table she was cleaning. The street outside was nearly deserted, save for the occasional car passing under the streetlights and the shadow of someone walking quickly past. The window collar turned up against the cold. Detroit in late October could be brutal, especially for those without proper winter coats or warm places to spend the night. Carmen had grown up in this neighborhood, had watched it change over the years as businesses closed and families moved, away in search of better opportunities. The corner grocery store where she used to buy penny candy had been boarded up for 2 years. The community center, where she'd learned to play basketball, had its funding cut, and now sat empty. Its windows covered with plywood and graffiti. Even the bus stop outside the diner had a broken shelter, offering little protection from the wind and rain that seemed to define Michigan's autumn weather. But Murphy's Corner Diner remained, a stubborn holdout against the tide of change that had swept through the area. It served as an anchor for the remaining residents, a place where you could still get a decent cup of coffee for under $2, and where Murphy himself would sometimes let people pay what they could when times got particularly tough. Carmen had been working there for 18 months, ever since she dropped out of community college to help support Isabella and their grandmother after their parents had been killed in a factory accident. The accident had changed everything overnight. One day, Carmen had been a typical college student worrying about midterm exams and whether she could afford the textbooks for next semester. The next day, she was the sole provider for a family of 3, navigating insurance paperwork, funeral arrangements, and the sudden realization that their small savings account wouldn't last more than a few weeks. The transition from student to caregiver had been jarring, but Carmen had adapted with the same quiet strength that had helped her survive 18 years in one of Detroit's most challenging neighborhoods. Murphy emerged from the kitchen, his white apron stained with grease and his gray hair disheveled from the heat of the grill. He was a man of few words, but his actions spoke volumes about his character. When Carmen had first approached him about the job, he'd taken one look at her situation and hired her on the spot, despite having no previous waitressing experience. He'd also made it clear that Isabella was welcome to do her homework in the corner booth, as long as she didn't disturb the paying customers. "Rodriguez," Murphy called out in his gravelly voice, using the surname he preferred for all his employees. "You can start closing out the register. Miguel's handling the last of the dishes." Carmen nodded and finished wiping down the table she'd been working on. The register was an ancient mechanical device that required a specific sequence of buttons and levers to produce the nightly sales report. She'd become proficient at operating it, though it still occasionally jammed or printed numbers that seemed to have no relationship to the actual transactions of the day. As she worked with the register, Carmen's mind wandered to the stack of bills waiting on the kitchen table back home. Rent was due in 5 days, and she was still $60 short. The electric bill had arrived yesterday with a bright yellow notice warning of disconnection if payment wasn't received within 7 days. Isabella needed new shoes before winter really set in, and their grandmother's medication would need to be refilled next week at a cost of $43 that wasn't currently available in their meager budget. The mathematics of poverty were relentless and unforgiving. Every dollar had to be accounted for, every expense weighed against the alternatives. Carmen had become an expert at stretching meals, finding sales, and making difficult decisions about which bills could be delayed and which demanded immediate attention. She'd learned to shop at the discount grocery store on the other side of town, where the produce wasn't always fresh, but the prices were manageable. She'd mastered the art of making one chicken last for 3 different meals, and she could calculate the exact amount of detergent needed to wash a load of clothes without waste. Isabella looked up from her book as Carmen approached with a wet cloth to clean the table around her homework. The girl's eyes held a maturity that shouldn't have belonged to someone her age, the kind of understanding that came from living with uncertainty and watching an older sister sacrifice her dreams for the sake of family survival. "Almost done?" Isabella asked quietly, carefully moving her papers to give Carmen access to the table surface. "Just finishing up the register and sweeping," Carmen replied, noting the fatigue in her sister's voice. Isabella had been at school all day, then spent 4 hours in the diner booth trying to focus on homework while surrounded by the noise and activity of the restaurant. It wasn't an ideal environment for studying, but it was better than leaving her alone in their apartment or asking their grandmother to supervise when she was barely capable of taking care of herself. The bell above the door chimed again, more insistently this time, as another gust of wind rattled the windows. Carmen glanced toward the entrance, half expecting to see a late-night customer wandering in for coffee and pie. Instead, she saw only the empty street and the reflection of the diner's interior lights in the dark glass. Murphy had retreated too, his small office behind the kitchen, where he would spend the next 30 minutes counting the day's receipts and preparing the bank deposit. Miguel, the night cook, was finishing the last of the dishes and beginning the process of cleaning the grill and fryer for tomorrow's service. The familiar sounds of closing time, the clatter of utensils being sorted, the whoosh of the industrial, a dishwasher, the scrape of chairs being stacked on tables, created a rhythm that Carmen had come to find oddly comforting. This was her world now, circumscribed by the walls of Murphy's Corner Diner and the 4 blocks surrounding their apartment building. It was smaller than the life she'd once imagined for herself, but it was real and immediate and filled with people who depended on her. Carmen had learned to find purpose in the daily routine of work and responsibility, even when that routine felt overwhelming and endless. The clock above the coffee machine ticked steadily toward midnight, marking another day's end in a life that had been fundamentally altered by circumstances beyond her control. Carmen finished wiping down Isabella's table and moved on to the final booth, her movements automatic and efficient. Tomorrow would bring another shift, another set of challenges, another day of careful calculations and difficult choices. But tonight, in the final minutes of her workday, Carmen allowed herself a moment to appreciate the small victories. Isabella was maintaining good grades despite the upheaval in their lives. Their grandmother had been stable for the past 3 weeks, with no major health scares or emergency room visits. The rent money would somehow be found, just as it had been found every month for the past 18 months since their parents' death. As she reached for the broom to begin sweeping, Carmen caught sight of movement outside the window. Someone was walking quickly past the diner, their figure barely visible in the space between streetlights. The night air looked cold and unwelcoming, and Carmen felt a familiar pang of gratitude for the warmth and relative security of the diner, even as she looked forward to the end of her shift and the walk home through the quiet streets of their neighborhood. The fluorescent lights continued their steady buzz overhead, casting their harsh but reliable glow across the worn surfaces and tired furniture of Murphy's Corner Diner. In less than 20 minutes, Carmen would lock the door behind her, take Isabella's hand, and begin the familiar walk home through the streets where they'd grown up, where they'd learned to navigate both the challenges and the unexpected kindnesses that defined life in their corner of Detroit. The mechanical register finally cooperated after Carmen's 3rd attempt at the closing sequence, producing a curled receipt that showed the night's modest earnings. $47 in tips. Not her worst night, but far from her best. She folded the bills carefully and tucked them into the small zippered pouch she kept in her uniform pocket, already mentally allocating each dollar toward the mounting expenses that awaited her at home. Isabella had closed her history textbook and was now sketching abstract patterns in the margins of her math homework, her creative mind finding outlet in the geometric shapes that flowed from her pencil. The girl possessed an artistic talent that Carmen recognized but couldn't afford to nurture properly. Art supplies cost money they didn't have, and extracurricular activities required fees that stretched their budget beyond its breaking point. Still, Carmen encouraged Isabella's creativity whenever possible, understanding that imagination and self-expression were among the few luxuries they could still afford. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The industrial dishwasher in the kitchen cycled through its final rinse, sending clouds of steam billowing through the pass-through window where finished plates normally waited for pickup. Miguel emerged from the kitchen, his dark hair damp with perspiration and his chef's coat bearing the evidence of another busy evening service. He nodded to Carmen as he untied his apron, a gesture of acknowledgement between fellow workers who understood the physical demands of restaurant labor. "Rough crowd tonight," Miguel commented in accented English, referring to a table of college students who had lingered for 2 hours over coffee and dessert before leaving a tip that barely covered the cost of their beverages. "But at least they were polite." Carmen smiled wearily, remembering the contrast between those customers and the businessman who had snapped his fingers at her earlier in the evening, treating her like an invisible servant rather than a human being trying to earn an honest living. She'd learned to develop a thick skin regarding customer behavior, understanding that people's treatment of service workers often reflected their own insecurities and frustrations rather than anything she had done wrong. Murphy's voice carried from his cramped office, where he was having what sounded like a heated phone conversation with the supplier about delayed deliveries and rising food costs. The restaurant business operated on razor-thin profit margins, and Carmen understood that her employer faced financial pressures that sometimes manifested in his gruff demeanor and reluctance to offer raises or bonuses. Still, Murphy had never missed a paycheck, and he'd allowed her flexible scheduling when Isabella was sick or their grandmother needed medical attention. The clock's steady ticking seemed to grow louder in the relative quiet of the nearly empty diner. Carmen began the methodical process of sweeping, starting from the far corner and working her way toward the front entrance. Each stroke of the broom revealed the detritus of another day's service. Sugar packets torn open and scattered, napkins crumpled under tables, the occasional forgotten pen or hair tie left behind by distracted customers. Isabella gathered her school supplies with practiced efficiency, organizing her materials in the worn backpack that had served her through 2 grade levels. The bag's zippers were beginning to fail, and one of the shoulder straps had been reinforced with safety pins after the original stitching gave way. Carmen made a mental note to check the thrift stores on her next day off, hoping to find a suitable replacement before the current bag deteriorated completely. The wind outside had intensified, rattling the diner's front door and sending debris skittering across the empty parking lot. A plastic bag caught on the antenna of an abandoned car across the street, fluttering like a tattered flag in the amber light of the street lamp. The scene beyond the windows looked desolate and inhospitable, a reminder of the harsh realities that awaited anyone without shelter or resources on a night like this. Carmen's sweeping rhythm was interrupted by a sharp tapping sound coming from somewhere behind the building. She paused, listening carefully to determine whether the noise was simply another manifestation of the wind or something that required investigation. The tapping came again, more insistent this time, followed by what sounded like a small voice, calling out in distress. Isabella looked up from her backpack, her expression alert and concerned. "Did you hear that?" she whispered, her voice barely audible above the ambient sounds of the diner's closing routine. Carmen nodded, setting the broom aside and moving toward the rear exit that led to the alley behind Murphy's corner diner. The back door was equipped with a security light that activated when motion was detected, but the bulb had burned out weeks ago and hadn't been replaced due to budget constraints. This meant that the narrow alley remained shrouded in darkness except for the faint illumination that spilled from the kitchen window. The tapping sound came again, accompanied this time by unmistakable sobbing. Carmen's maternal instincts, honed through months of caring for Isabella and their grandmother, immediately overrode any concerns about personal safety. She turned the deadbolt and pushed open the heavy metal door, allowing the cold night air to rush into the warm interior of the diner. "Hello?" she called out into the darkness, her voice carrying both authority and compassion. "Is someone out? There. Are you okay?" The sobbing stopped abruptly, replaced by a tense silence that suggested someone was trying to remain hidden while simultaneously hoping for help. Carmen stepped fully outside, allowing her eyes to adjust to the dim lighting. Conditions. The alley stretched in both directions, bounded by the brick walls of neighboring buildings and punctuated by large dumpsters that served the various businesses along this stretch of the street. Movement near the far dumpster caught her attention. A small figure hunched between two large trash containers, partially concealed behind a pile of cardboard boxes that had been left out for the morning pickup. Carmen approached slowly, speaking in the gentle tone she used when Isabella woke from nightmares about their parents' accident. "Hey there," she said softly, crouching down to make herself less imposing. "My name is Carmen. I work in the diner. Right here. Are you hurt? Do you need help?" The figure shifted slightly, revealing the pale face of a young girl who couldn't have been more than 9 or 10 years old. Her blonde hair was tangled and dirty, and her clothes, a thin pink dress that offered little protection against the October cold, were torn and stained with what looked like mud and worse. The child's eyes were wide with fear and exhaustion, darting between Carmen's face and the alley entrance as if calculating escape routes. Carmen's heart constricted at the sight. This was someone's daughter, someone's precious child, reduced to hiding behind dumpsters in a Detroit alley on a night when the temperature was dropping toward freezing. The girl's obvious terror and desperate condition triggered every protective instinct Carmen possessed, reminding her of her own vulnerability and the thin line that separated stability from catastrophe. "What's your name, sweetheart?" Carmen asked, maintaining her crouched position to avoid seeming threatening. "Are you lost? Where are your parents?" The girl opened her mouth as if to speak, then closed it again, shaking her head violently. Fresh tears began streaming down her dirt-stained cheeks, and Carmen noticed that her small hands were trembling from more than just the cold. This child had experienced something traumatic, something that had left her too frightened to trust, even a seemingly helpful adult. Isabella appeared in the doorway of the diner, her young face etched with concern as she observed the scene unfolding in the alley. "Carmen," she called out quietly. "Is everything all right?" The sound of Isabella's voice seemed to have a calming effect on the frightened girl, perhaps because another child represented less of a threat than an adult. The girl's rigid posture relaxed slightly, and she turned her attention toward Isabella. With something that might have been hope flickering in her exhausted eyes, Carmen made a quick decision, understanding that time was a critical factor in this situation. The girl was clearly in immediate danger from exposure to the elements, and her obvious fear suggested that whatever had brought her to this alley was far from resolved. The temperature was continuing to drop, and hypothermia could become a real concern if action wasn't taken quickly. "Isabella, could you bring me that extra sweatshirt from behind the counter?" Carmen requested, never taking her eyes off the frightened child. "And maybe grab a cup of hot chocolate from the machine, if there's still some made." Isabella nodded and disappeared back into the diner, her footsteps echoing in the sudden quiet. Carmen turned her attention back to the girl, who was now watching her with a mixture of wariness and desperate need. The child's breathing was shallow and rapid, suggesting either panic or the early stages of shock. "I know you're scared," Carmen said gently, "and I know you don't know whether you can trust me, but you're cold and you're hurt, and I want to help you. You don't have to tell me anything you don't want to tell me, but please let me get you somewhere warm." The girl's response was barely audible, a whisper that Carmen had to strain to hear above the wind rattling through the alley. They said no one would believe me. They said I could never go home." The words sent a chill through Carmen that had nothing to do with the October air. This child had been threatened, manipulated, possibly worse. The implications were horrifying, but Carmen forced herself to remain calm and focused. Whatever had happened to this girl, whatever had brought her to this desperate situation, could be addressed once she was safe and warm. "Who said that, honey?" Carmen asked carefully, not wanting to push too hard, but needing to understand the scope of the danger. "Who told you those things?" Before the girl could answer, Isabella returned with the requested items, moving quietly through the back door and approaching the pair with the respectful caution of someone who understood that the situation required delicate handling. She handed Carmen the sweatshirt, a large grey hoodie that Murphy had left behind months earlier, and held out a steaming cup of hot chocolate, topped with miniature marshmallows. The girl's eyes fixed on the cup with an intensity that spoke of genuine hunger and thirst. Carmen realized that the child might not have eaten or drunk anything substantial in hours, possibly days. The recognition hit her like a physical blow, understanding viscerally what it meant for a child this young to be struggling for basic survival on the streets of Detroit. "Here," Isabella said gently, extending the cup toward the girl. "It's really good. Carmen makes the best hot chocolate in the whole diner." The girl reached out tentatively, her small hands barely able to wrap around the warm ceramic mug. She took a careful sip, then another, her eyes closing briefly as the warmth spread through her obviously chilled body. Carmen draped the oversized sweatshirt around the child's shoulders, noting how the garment immediately dwarfed her small frame, but provided essential protection against the cold. Murphy's voice called out from inside the diner, his tone carrying the impatience of someone ready to lock up and go home. "Rodriguez, we need to close up here." Carmen felt the familiar tension between her responsibilities, her job, her employer's expectations, the practical necessities of her own survival, and the moral imperative that stood shivering before her in the form of a terrified child. She understood that taking action might jeopardize her employment, her family's financial stability, their carefully maintained routine of survival. But she also understood that some situations demanded immediate response, regardless of personal cost. "I'll be right there," she called back, then turned to the girl. "Listen, sweetheart, I need to finish my work inside, but I'm not going to leave you out here. Can you come inside with us? It's warm and there's more food if you're hungry." The girl looked uncertain, glancing between Carmen's face and the back door of the diner, as if weighing risks she was too young to fully understand. Finally, she nodded once, a small gesture that carried enormous trust given her obvious terror and traumatic recent experiences. Carmen helped the girl to her feet, noting how unsteady she seemed and how the oversized sweatshirt hung nearly to her knees. Isabella took the girl's free hand, offering the kind of immediate acceptance and kindness that came naturally to children who had themselves experienced hardship and uncertainty. Together, the three of them walked toward the back door of Murphy's corner diner, crossing the threshold from the cold darkness of the alley into the warm, fluorescent-lit interior that represented safety, sustenance, and the possibility of hope. Carmen understood that this moment marked a turning point, not just for the frightened child they were helping, but for her own family's carefully constructed life of routine and survival. The warmth of the diner's interior enveloped them as Carmen guided the trembling girl through the back entrance, past the industrial kitchen equipment that gleamed under the harsh overhead lighting. The child's bare legs were mottled red and purple from exposure to the cold, and Carmen noticed that her small feet were protected only by a pair of canvas sneakers so worn that the rubber soles had separated from the fabric in several places. Murphy emerged from his office just as the trio entered the main dining area, his weathered face immediately registering surprise and then irritation at the sight of the unknown child. His grey eyebrows knitted together in a scowl that Carmen had seen many times before, usually directed at suppliers who delivered substandard ingredients or customers who tried to leave without paying their bills. "What the hell is this, Rodriguez?" Murphy's voice carried the sharp edge of someone whose patience had been exhausted by a long day of managing a struggling business. "We're not running a damn shelter here. I've got insurance liability to think about." The girl instinctively pressed closer to Carmen's side, her small frame trembling with renewed fear at the harsh tone. Isabella moved protectively to the child's other side, creating a barrier of feminine solidarity against Murphy's obvious displeasure. The hot chocolate cup rattled slightly in the girl's hands, betraying her nervousness despite the brave face she was trying to maintain. Carmen felt her pulse quicken as she recognized the crossroads that had suddenly materialized before her. Murphy's position was understandable from a business perspective. Allowing unknown individuals into the restaurant after hours created potential legal and financial complications that a small business owner couldn't afford to ignore. But the alternative, sending this clearly traumatized child back into the October night, was morally unthinkable. "She was hiding behind the dumpsters," Carmen explained, keeping her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her system. "She's cold and scared and she needs help. I couldn't just leave her out there." Murphy's expression didn't soften. If anything, his frown deepened as he absorbed the implications of Carmen's words. "That's not our problem, Rodriguez. Call the cops, call social services, call somebody else. But she can't stay here. I've got a business to protect." The finality in Murphy's tone made it clear that this wasn't a negotiation. Carmen understood the economic realities that drove his decision. Insurance premiums, licensing requirements, the constant struggle to maintain profitability in an industry notorious for its razor-thin margins. Murphy had already shown considerable flexibility by allowing Isabella to spend her after-school hours in the diner, and asking for additional accommodations pushed the boundaries of what he considered reasonable. Carmen looked down at the girl, who was staring at the floor with the defeated posture of someone who had learned to expect rejection and disappointment. The child's blonde hair fell across her face like a curtain, but Carmen could see the tears that had begun to fall silently onto the worn linoleum. This wasn't just about providing temporary shelter. This was about demonstrating to a traumatized child that adults could be trusted to prioritize her safety over their own convenience. "Mr. Murphy," Carmen began, choosing her words carefully, "I understand your concerns. But what if we just called the authorities from here? Let her stay warm while we wait for someone to come pick her up." Murphy shook his head decisively. "No way. Once you involve the cops, they start asking questions. Who found her? Where? When? How long has she been here? Next thing you know, we're all giving statements, and I'm dealing with investigators and social workers crawling all over my establishment. Bad for business, Rodriguez. Bad for everyone." Miguel had finished cleaning the kitchen and was preparing to leave through the back exit, but he paused when he noticed the tension in the dining area. His dark eyes took in the scene. The frightened child, Carmen's protective stance, Murphy's obvious agitation, and his expression reflected the internal conflict of someone who wanted to help but recognized the complexity of the situation. "Maybe," Miguel suggested quietly, "we could drive her to the police station ourselves, drop her off where she'll be safe but not involve the restaurant directly." Murphy considered this proposal for a moment, then nodded grudgingly. "That works. Rodriguez, you finish closing duties first, then you can play Good Samaritan on your own time. But make it quick. I want everyone out of here in 10 minutes. Carmen felt a surge of relief, but it was immediately tempered by practical concerns. Her aging Honda Civic was currently at the mechanic's shop, having failed inspection due to a faulty emissions system that would cost more to repair than the car was worth. Isabella typically walked to and from the diner, a routine that worked adequately during daylight hours, but became problematic late at night. especially when the weather was inclement. "I don't have a car tonight," Carmen admitted, feeling her cheeks flush with embarrassment. The admission revealed more about her financial circumstances than she preferred to share with her employer, highlighting the precarious nature of her family's situation. Murphy's impatience flared again. "Then call a cab. Figure it out, Rodriguez. I'm not running a transportation service either." The cost of a taxi ride to the nearest police station would consume nearly half of Carmen's tip money from the evening, leaving her even further behind on the rent payment that was due in 5 days. But the arithmetic of survival had to be weighed against the immediate needs of a child who had no other advocates at this moment. Isabella tugged gently on Carmen's sleeve, drawing her attention away from the financial calculations racing through her mind. "What if we walked?" she suggested quietly. "It's only about 12 blocks to the police station on Grand River. I know the way." Carmen's protective instincts immediately rebelled against the idea of walking through Detroit's east side at midnight. With 2 children in tow, one of whom was clearly traumatized and potentially being pursued by dangerous individuals, the neighborhood's crime statistics made such a journey inadvisable under the best circumstances, and these were far from ideal conditions. The girl finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper, but carrying surprising determination. "I don't want to go to the police." The simple statement hung in the air like a challenge, forcing everyone to confront the complexity of the situation. Carmen knelt down to the child's eye level, noting the mix of fear and resolve in her pale blue eyes. This wasn't the petulance of a spoiled child avoiding consequences. This was genuine terror based on experiences that had taught her to distrust authority figures. "Why not, sweetheart?" Carmen asked gently. "The police are supposed to help children who are in trouble." The girl's grip tightened on the hot chocolate cup, her knuckles showing white against the ceramic surface. "They said, the people who took me, they said they had friends everywhere, police, social workers, judges. They said if I ever tried to get help, their friends would make sure I disappeared forever." The words sent a chill through the room that had nothing to do with the October weather outside. Carmen exchanged glances with Isabella, both of them recognizing the implications of what they had just heard. This wasn't a simple case of a lost child who needed to be reunited with worried parents. This was potentially a human trafficking situation involving organized criminals with connections throughout the system. Murphy's expression had shifted from irritation to genuine concern as the gravity of the situation became clear. His business instincts warred with his basic human decency, creating visible tension in his weathered features. Carmen could see him calculating risks, the danger of involvement versus the moral cost of abandonment. "Jesus Christ," Murphy muttered under his breath, running his hands through his gray hair. "This is way above my pay grade, Rodriguez." Carmen stood slowly, her mind racing through possible alternatives. Traditional authorities were ruled out by the girl's terror and the potential corruption she described. Family members or guardians were apparently either absent or complicit in whatever had happened to her. Social services, even if uncorrupted, would require paperwork and procedures that might take hours or days to implement. "What's your name, honey?" Carmen asked the girl, hoping that establishing basic communication might reveal additional options. "Sophia," the child replied, then immediately looked frightened, as if revealing her name had somehow violated instructions she'd been given. Carmen nodded encouragingly. "That's a beautiful name, Sophia. Can you tell me how old you are?" 8, Sophia whispered, then added with heartbreaking precision, "I'll be 9 in January, if I'm still." She trailed off, unable or unwilling to complete the thought. The conditional nature of her birthday planning struck Carmen like a physical blow. This child had been conditioned to believe that her survival was uncertain, that her future was dependent on factors beyond her control. The psychological damage implied by such thinking was staggering, suggesting systematic abuse and manipulation designed to break down her sense of agency and hope. Isabella had been listening to the conversation, with growing distress, her young face reflecting the emotional turmoil of witnessing another child's suffering. She reached out tentatively and took Sophia's free hand, offering the wordless comfort that children sometimes provided more effectively than adults. "You can stay with us tonight," Isabella declared, with the confident certainty of someone who hadn't yet learned to calculate the practical obstacles to kindness. Carmen always figures out how to help people. Murphy's sharp intake of breath indicated his immediate objection to this proposal, but Carmen held up a hand to forestall his protest. She needed time to think, to weigh options that all seemed to carry significant risks and costs. Taking Sophia home would mean involving their grandmother, creating potential legal complications and stretching their already inadequate resources. Even further, but the alternatives, abandoning her to the night, forcing her into a system she believed was compromised, or washing their hands of responsibility, were simply unacceptable. "Rodriguez," Murphy said slowly, his voice carrying a warning tone, "whatever you're thinking, think harder. You've got your own family to worry about. You can't save every lost kid in Detroit." Carmen understood the wisdom in Murphy's words, recognized the practical truth that her resources were limited and her own family's stability remained precarious. But she also understood that some moments demanded action regardless of consequences, that moral clarity sometimes required setting aside practical considerations in favor of doing what was right. "I know," Carmen replied quietly, her hand resting protectively on Sophia's shoulder, "but I can save this one." The decision crystallized in that moment, becoming as inevitable as gravity or the turning of the earth. Carmen would take Sophia home, would find a way to provide safety and care despite the challenges it would create. The mathematics of survival would have to be recalculated, the careful balance of their household budget disrupted, the routines that had kept their family afloat since their parents' death fundamentally altered. Murphy stared at her for a long moment, his expressions cycling through frustration, resignation, and something that might have been grudging respect. Finally, he shook his head and reached into his pocket, pulling out a worn leather wallet that had seen better decades. "Here," he said gruffly, extracting two $20 bills and pressing them into Carmen's hand. "For whatever the hell you think you're doing. And Rodriguez, don't make me regret this." Carmen looked down at the money in surprise, understanding that Murphy's gesture represented more than simple generosity. It was acknowledgement of her choice, tacit approval of her decision to prioritize human compassion over practical considerations. The $40 wouldn't solve all their financial problems, but it would provide a crucial buffer against the immediate costs of caring for Sophia. "Thank you, Mr. Murphy," Carmen said sincerely, pocketing the bills with hands that trembled. Slightly from the magnitude of what she was undertaking, Murphy waved off her gratitude with characteristic gruffness. "Yeah, well, just remember this conversation next time you think about asking for a raise." Despite the tension of the moment, Carmen found herself smiling at Murphy's attempt to maintain his reputation for curmudgeonly behavior. She gathered Sophia closer, noting how the child seemed to have relaxed slightly now that the immediate threat of being sent away had passed. "Come on, girls," Carmen said gently, addressing both Isabella and Sophia. "Let's go home." The autumn wind had intensified during the time they'd spent inside the diner, transforming the relatively calm evening into a blustery night that sent plastic bags and loose papers dancing through the empty streets like urban tumbleweeds. Carmen zipped up her thin jacket and pulled the hood over her head, knowing that the inadequate garment would provide little protection against the dropping temperature, but having no alternative clothing available. Sophia clutched Murphy's oversized gray hoodie around her small frame, the fabric pooling around her feet as she walked. Isabella had insisted on carrying the child's empty hot chocolate cup, declaring that it might be useful later and refusing to leave it behind, despite the impracticality of transporting unnecessary items during their trek home. The gesture was typical of Isabella's compassionate nature, finding symbolic importance in objects that others might consider disposable. The three of them stepped out onto the sidewalk in front of Murphy's Corner diner, and Carmen immediately felt the full force of the October night. The temperature had dropped at least 10 degrees since her earlier venture into the alley, and the wind carried the promise of an early winter that would strain their already inadequate heating budget. She pulled Sophia closer to her side, noting how the child seemed to shrink into herself against the cold. "It's not far," Carmen assured them both, though she privately worried about Sophia's ability to walk 12 blocks in her current condition. The girl's legs were still mottled from cold exposure, and her worn sneakers provided minimal insulation against the concrete sidewalk that would leach warmth from her feet with every step. Isabella positioned herself on Sophia's other side, creating a protective formation that would shield the smaller girl from the worst of the wind. "We can stop and rest whenever you need to," she told Sophia, with the earnest sincerity of someone who understood what it meant to feel overwhelmed by circumstances beyond your control. They began walking east on 8 Mile Road, passing under the intermittent pools of light cast by street lamps that had survived the municipal budget cuts. Many of the bulbs had burned out and remained unreplaced, creating dark stretches where the only illumination came from the occasional passing car or the neon signs of late-night businesses that catered to shift workers and insomniacs. The neighborhood revealed its character differently at midnight than during the daylight hours when Carmen typically traveled these streets. Shadows concealed the details of urban decay that were stark and unavoidable in sunlight: the boarded windows, the overgrown lots where houses had been demolished and never rebuilt, the accumulation of litter that collected in doorways and against chain-link fences like urban sediment, marking the passage of neglect. But darkness also softened some harsh realities, transforming the industrial landscape into something almost mysterious. The distant glow of downtown Detroit created a pale backdrop against the night sky, while the occasional warm light spilling from apartment windows suggested the persistence of human habitation and hope despite the area's challenges. Sophia walked with the careful precision of someone conserving energy for an uncertain journey ahead. Her breathing remained shallow and quick, suggesting either ongoing fear or the physical stress of her ordeal. Carmen found herself adjusting their pace to accommodate the child's shorter stride and obvious fatigue, understanding that rushing would serve no purpose if it led to exhaustion or collapse. "Sophia," Carmen said gently as they waited for the traffic light at the intersection of 8 Mile and Woodward, "are you feeling okay? Do you need to rest for a minute?" The girl shook her head quickly, perhaps too quickly, suggesting that her determination to continue was driven more by fear of being abandoned than by actual physical capability. "I'm fine," she whispered, though her voice carried the strain of someone pushing beyond their limits. Isabella glanced at Carmen with concern, recognizing the signs of someone struggling but unwilling to admit weakness. She'd developed a keen sensitivity to such situations during the months following their parents' death, when Carmen had often pushed herself past exhaustion while maintaining the pretense that everything was under control. "You know what?" Isabella announced with sudden inspiration. "I'm getting tired. Maybe we should take a little break here." She gestured toward a bus stop shelter that offered minimal protection from the wind, but would allow them to sit down and assess their situation. Carmen smiled at her sister's diplomatic approach, understanding that Isabella was providing Sophia with a face-saving opportunity to rest without having to admit her own limitations. The three of them settled onto the metal bench inside the shelter, with Sophia positioned between the two sisters, where she would receive maximum warmth and protection. The brief respite allowed Carmen to observe Sophia more carefully in the light, provided by the bus stop's single functioning fluorescent tube. The child's skin had a greyish pallor that suggested more than simple cold exposure, and Carmen noticed small bruises on her arms that were partially hidden by the sleeves of Murphy's hoodie. The implications were disturbing, confirming her suspicions that Sophia had endured physical abuse in addition to whatever psychological trauma had left her terrified of authority figures. "Sophia," Carmen began carefully, "the people who hurt. Are they still looking for you?" The girl's immediate tension provided an answer before her words did. Her entire body went rigid, and her eyes darted nervously toward the street as if expecting pursuit at any moment. "I don't know," she whispered. "Maybe. They said I belonged to them now, that I could never really get away." The casual brutality of such psychological manipulation struck Carmen like a physical blow. This child had been systematically conditioned to believe that escape was impossible, that her captors possessed unlimited power and reach. The mental chains forged by such messaging were often more effective than physical restraints, creating a prison of learned helplessness that could persist long after rescue. Isabella reached over and took Sophia's hand, squeezing gently. "Well, they were wrong," she declared with fierce certainty. "You're with us now, and Carmen doesn't let bad things happen to people she cares about." Carmen felt the weight of Isabella's faith in her capabilities, understanding that her younger sister's confidence was based more on hope than on evidence. The truth was that Carmen felt completely out of her depth, improvising responses to a situation that required expertise she didn't possess. But sometimes courage consisted simply of moving forward despite uncertainty, of choosing action over paralysis when inaction guaranteed harm. "That's right," Carmen agreed, hoping her voice conveyed more confidence than she felt. "You're safe now, Sophia. We're going to figure this out together." A city bus rumbled past the shelter, its interior lights revealing a handful of late-shift workers heading home from jobs in the service industry. Carmen found herself wondering about their stories, about the small daily struggles and quiet victories that defined working-class life in Detroit. Everyone carried burdens that remained invisible to casual observation, shouldering responsibilities that tested the limits of human endurance. The wind gusted again, rattling the shelter's plexiglass walls and reminding them that they couldn't remain stationary indefinitely. Carmen stood and helped Sophia to her feet, noting how the brief rest had seemed to restore some of the child's energy. The remaining distance to their apartment building wouldn't be easy, but it was manageable if they maintained a steady pace and avoided any complications. They resumed walking, turning south on Conant Street toward the residential area where Carmen's family had lived for the past 4 years. The change in neighborhood character was subtle but noticeable. Fewer commercial buildings, more apartment complexes and small houses, the occasional front porch light suggesting families settling in for the night behind locked doors and drawn curtains. Sophia stumbled slightly on an uneven section of sidewalk, and Carmen immediately reached out to steady her. The child's weight against her arm felt alarmingly light, emphasizing how much the ordeal had taken from her small frame. Carmen made a mental note to ensure that Sophia received proper nutrition once they reached home, though their own food supplies were limited and would need to be stretched to accommodate an additional person. "Almost there," Carmen announced as they turned onto their street, recognizing the familiar landmarks that marked their approach to home. The burned-out shell of a corner grocery store, the community garden where neighbors grew vegetables during the summer months, the apartment building with the distinctive purple front door that someone had painted in violation of lease terms, but which management had never bothered to address. Their own building came into view, a three-story brick structure that had been constructed during Detroit's industrial heyday and had aged with varying degrees of grace. The exterior walls showed the weathering of decades, with mortar joints that needed attention and window frames that had been painted so many times that the layers created an uneven surface. But the building was structurally sound and reasonably well maintained, offering reliable shelter at a rent that Carmen could afford through careful budgeting. Isabella pulled out the key ring that she carried as backup to Carmen's, selecting the proper key with the practiced efficiency of someone who had performed this routine hundreds of times. The front door opened with the familiar squeak that announced arrivals and departures to anyone within earshot, a sound that Carmen had come to associate with the safety and predictability of home. The lobby was small and utilitarian, featuring mailboxes that showed varying degrees of maintenance and a bulletin board where residents posted notices about lost pets, items for sale, and community meetings that few people attended. The overhead light had been replaced recently, casting everything in harsh white illumination that revealed details better left obscured. Carmen guided them toward the stairwell, knowing that their second-floor apartment required climbing one flight of stairs that might prove challenging for Sophia in her current condition. But the child managed the ascent without complaint, clinging to the metal handrail and taking the steps one at a time with determined concentration. The hallway on their floor was carpeted with industrial-grade material that had been chosen for durability rather than aesthetics. The walls displayed the accumulated scuffs and marks of countless moves, with residents transporting furniture and belongings through the narrow space. Carmen could hear the muffled sounds of daily life behind the various doors, television programs, conversations, the occasional cry of a baby whose parents were probably struggling with their own challenges. Their apartment door bore the number 2B in brass digits that had tarnished to a dull brown. Carmen inserted her key and turned the lock, pushing open the door to reveal the modest but clean interior that had served as their family's refuge since their parents' death. The living room was small but efficiently arranged, with furniture that had been selected more for function than style, but which created an atmosphere of warmth and stability. Sophia stepped across the threshold hesitantly, her eyes taking in the details of their home with the careful observation of someone who had learned to quickly assess new environments for potential threats and opportunities. Carmen watched the child's face, hoping to see some relaxation of the hypervigilance that had marked her behavior since they'd found her in the alley. "Welcome home," Isabella said warmly, hanging her jacket on one of the hooks by the door and gesturing for Sophia to do the same with Murphy's oversized hoodie. The simple phrase, "welcome home," seemed to have an unexpected impact on Sophia. Her composure finally cracked, and she began to cry with the deep, shuddering sobs of someone releasing emotions that had been held in check through sheer force of will. Carmen immediately knelt down and gathered the child into her arms, feeling the fragile frame shake with the intensity of grief and relief and terror, all combined into one overwhelming expression of pain. "It's okay," Carmen whispered, rocking slightly as she held Sophia close. "You're safe now, you're home." The sound of Sophia's crying had awakened their grandmother, whose shuffling footsteps could be heard approaching from the bedroom before her frail silhouette appeared in the doorway. Esperanza Rodriguez moved with the careful deliberation of someone whose balance had been compromised by her strokes, one hand trailing along the wall for support, while her clouded eyes struggled to focus on the unexpected scene before her. "Mija!" Esperanza's voice carried the confusion of someone emerging from deep sleep, her Spanish accent more pronounced when she was disoriented. "¿Qué pasa? What's happening here?" Carmen looked up from where she knelt holding Sophia, realizing that she was about to introduce another complication into their already strained household dynamics. Esperanza's cognitive abilities had been significantly impacted by her medical episodes, leaving her capable of basic self-care, but struggling with complex situations or unexpected changes to routine. The presence of an unknown child would require explanations that might prove difficult for their grandmother to process and accept. "Abuela, this is Sofia," Carmen said gently, using the diminutive form of address that had always marked their relationship. "She needed help, so we brought her home with us. She's going to stay here tonight." Esperanza's weathered features displayed the mental effort required to process this information. Her eyes moved from Carmen to Isabella to the crying child, attempting to construct a narrative that would make sense of the situation. The stroke damage had affected her short-term memory formation, making it difficult for her to retain new information or adapt to circumstances that didn't match her established expectations. "As familiar?" Esperanza asked, wanting to know if Sofia was related to them in some way that would explain her presence in their home. Isabella stepped forward, taking their grandmother's free hand with the gentle patience that had developed over months of helping care for her. "No, Abuela, but she needs our help. Carmen found her outside and she was cold and scared. You always taught us to help people who are in trouble, remember?" The appeal to Esperanza's fundamental values seemed to penetrate her confusion, triggering memories of lessons she had imparted when her mind was sharper and her body stronger. She nodded slowly, her expression softening as maternal instincts that transcended cognitive impairment asserted themselves. "Sí, claro," Esperanza agreed, shuffling closer to examine Sofia with the careful attention of someone who had raised children and recognized distress when she saw it. "La pobrecita está muy flaca. This little one is too thin. We need to feed her." Carmen felt a surge of gratitude for her grandmother's immediate acceptance, understanding that Esperanza's response would set the tone for how successfully they could integrate Sofia into their household. The elderly woman's diminished cognitive capacity sometimes created challenges, but it also stripped away the complex calculations that might lead others to reject additional responsibility. Sofia's sobbing had begun to subside, replaced by the occasional hiccup and sniffle that marked the aftermath of intense emotional release. She remained pressed against Carmen's shoulder, but her body had lost some of the rigid tension that had characterized her posture since they'd found her in the alley. The simple act of being held without judgment or demand seemed to be providing the foundation for tentative trust. "Are you feeling a little better?" Carmen asked softly, pulling back slightly to look at Sofia's tear-stained face. The child's pale blue eyes were red-rimmed but more alert than they had been, suggesting that the emotional catharsis had cleared away some of the shock and exhaustion that had been clouding her responses. Sofia nodded hesitantly, wiping her nose with the sleeve of Murphy's hoodie. "I'm sorry," she whispered, the automatic apology of someone who had been conditioned to believe that expressing pain was a burden to others. "You don't need to be sorry," Carmen assured her firmly. "You haven't done anything wrong. You're safe here, and you can feel whatever you need to feel." Isabella had moved to the small kitchen area that adjoined their living room, opening cabinets with the practical efficiency of someone assessing available resources. Their food supplies were limited but adequate for basic nutrition, consisting primarily of staples like rice, beans, pasta, and canned vegetables that could be combined in various ways to create filling meals on a tight budget. "We have some chicken soup in a can," Isabella announced, examining the labels of their stored provisions. "And there's bread that's still good. Abuela, do you want me to heat up the soup for Sofia?" Esperanza had settled into her favorite armchair, the one positioned near the window where she could observe street activity during the day. Despite her cognitive limitations, She retained strong opinions about hospitality and the proper care of guests, especially children who appeared to be suffering from neglect or abuse. "Si, pero add some rice to make it more filling," Esperanza instructed, falling back on the cooking wisdom she had developed during decades of stretching limited ingredients to feed hungry families. "And bring me that tin from the kitchen counter. I have some crackers saved from yesterday." Carmen helped Sophia to the couch, noting how the child's eyes followed Isabella's movements with the intense focus of someone who had learned to pay careful attention to food preparation and distribution. The reaction suggested that consistent access to nutrition had been an issue during her captivity, creating the hypervigilance that often developed in people who had experienced food insecurity. "When was the last time you had a real meal?" Carmen asked gently, settling beside Sophia on the worn fabric cushions that had been their family's primary seating for the past 4 years. Sophia's brow furrowed as she attempted to calculate time periods that had probably blurred together during her ordeal. "I don't know," she admitted. "They gave me things sometimes, but not very much, and not every day. They said I had to earn food by being good." The casual mention of food being used as a control mechanism confirmed Carmen's worst suspicions about the nature of Sophia's captivity. Using basic survival needs as rewards for compliance was a classic technique employed by traffickers to break down their victims' resistance and create psychological dependency. The fact that an 8-year-old child could discuss such treatment matter-of-factly spoke to the systematic nature of the abuse she had endured. Isabella returned from the kitchen carrying a steaming bowl of soup that she had enhanced with rice and seasonings, along with a plate of crackers that Esperanza had been saving for special occasions. The aroma of warm chicken broth filled the small living room, creating an atmosphere of comfort and nourishment that seemed to have an immediate calming effect on Sophia. "Here," Isabella said, settling the bowl on the coffee table and pulling up a chair so she could sit beside Sophia. "It's not fancy, but it's warm and it'll help you feel stronger." Sophia accepted the spoon with trembling hands, taking small, careful sips as if testing whether the food was real or might be taken away without warning. Carmen watched the child's methodical approach to eating, recognizing the behavior patterns of someone who had learned to make limited resources last as long as possible. "You can eat as much as you want," Carmen assured her. "There's more if you're still hungry when you finish that bowl." The permission seemed to unlock something in Sophia's demeanor, and she began eating with the focused intensity of genuine hunger. Carmen estimated that the child had probably lost at least 10 pounds during her captivity, leaving her small frame even more fragile than it should have been for someone her age. While Sophia ate, Carmen found herself calculating the additional expenses that would be required to properly care for another person in their household. Food costs would increase significantly, especially given Sophia's obvious need for nutritional rehabilitation. Medical care would be essential but expensive, particularly if they avoided official channels that might trigger the investigation Sophia feared. Clothing appropriate for the approaching winter would be necessary, along with basic personal items that hadn't been part of their original budget planning. The mathematics were daunting, but Carmen pushed the concerns aside for the moment. Immediate needs took precedence over long-term financial planning, and Sophia's safety and recovery were more important than their already precarious economic situation. Somehow they would find a way to make it work, just as they had found ways to survive every previous challenge. Esperanza had been observing Sophia with the careful attention of someone whose life experience had taught her to recognize certain types of trauma. Despite her cognitive limitations, the elderly woman possessed an intuitive understanding about human suffering that transcended her medical condition. "This child has been hurt badly," Esperanza said quietly to Carmen in Spanish, using the language they employed when discussing sensitive topics they didn't want Isabella to fully understand. Not just her body, but her spirit. She has the eyes of someone much older. Carmen nodded, recognizing the accuracy of her grandmother's assessment. Sophia's hypervigilance, her careful approach to eating, her automatic apologies, all were indicators of systematic abuse designed to break down normal childhood responses and replace them with survival mechanisms. The healing process would require patience, consistency, and resources they could barely afford. "We'll help her," Carmen replied in Spanish, making the commitment that would reshape their family's future. "Whatever it takes." Isabella, who understood more Spanish than she typically admitted, looked up from where she had been arranging additional blankets on the couch. "Sophia can sleep in my room," she announced. "I'll take the couch tonight so she can have the bed. She needs it more than I do." Carmen felt her heart constrict at Isabella's immediate willingness to sacrifice her own comfort for someone she had known for less than 2 hours. The gesture reflected the values their parents had instilled and their grandmother had reinforced. The understanding that family was defined not by blood alone, but by the willingness to care for those who needed protection. "That's very kind of you, Isabella," Carmen said, "but are you sure? Your bed is the only private space you have." Isabella shrugged with the casual generosity that came naturally to children who hadn't yet learned to calculate the personal cost of kindness. "She's been sleeping in scary places. She should have somewhere soft and safe." Sophia looked up from her soup bowl, her eyes bright with tears that seemed different from the earlier expressions of grief and fear. These appeared to be tears of surprise and gratitude, as if the concept of strangers offering genuine kindness without expectation of payment was foreign to her recent experience. "You would do that for me?" Sophia asked Isabella, her voice small but filled with wonder. "Of course," Isabella replied matter-of-factly. "That's what families do for each other, and you're part of our family now." The simple declaration hung in the air like a promise, creating a moment of profound connection that transcended the practical challenges they would undoubtedly face. Carmen understood that Isabella's words had just redefined their household composition, expanding their definition of family to include someone who needed them desperately and whom they were choosing to claim as their own. Esperanza reached over and patted Sophia's hand with the gentle touch of someone who understood that healing often began with simple human contact. "See, mija, you belong here now. We take care of each other in this family." Carmen looked around at the 3 generations of women who now constituted their household. Her grandmother, whose wisdom persisted despite cognitive decline. Her sister, whose compassion seemed unlimited despite their circumstances. And the traumatized child who would test every resource they possessed. The responsibility felt overwhelming, but it also felt right in a way that transcended rational analysis. Outside their apartment windows, Detroit continued its nighttime routine of shift workers heading home, emergency vehicles responding to crises, and the countless small dramas that played out in urban environments across the country. But inside apartment 2B, a new family configuration was taking shape, bound together by choice rather than circumstance, and strengthened by the shared commitment to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. As Sophia finished her soup and Isabella prepared the bedroom for their new sister, Carmen began mentally preparing for the challenges that tomorrow would bring. There would be difficult conversations, impossible decisions, and probably more crises than solutions. But tonight, they had provided safety for someone who desperately needed it, and that accomplishment felt like the most important work she had ever done. The first rays of dawn filtered through the thin curtains of Isabella's bedroom, casting pale golden light across the sleeping figure of Sophia, who lay curled beneath layers of blankets that the Rodriguez family had carefully arranged. The night before, Her breathing had finally settled into the deep, rhythmic pattern of genuine rest. Her small face relaxed for the first time since they'd discovered her hiding behind the dumpsters. Carmen stood in the doorway, having awakened early despite her exhaustion, her mind racing with the practical challenges that daylight would bring. The previous night's emotional intensity had given way to the stark reality of providing care for a traumatized child while maintaining their own fragile stability. She needed to call Murphy's Diner to arrange coverage for her morning shift, contact Isabella's school to explain why she might be late, and somehow find medical attention for Sophia without triggering the official investigations that the child feared. Isabella had insisted on sleeping on the living room couch, transforming the small space into a makeshift bedroom with pillows from various chairs and a spare blanket that had belonged to their mother. Despite the uncomfortable sleeping arrangement, she had slept peacefully, her natural resilience allowing her to adapt to changed circumstances with the flexibility that children often displayed better than adults. Esperanza was already awake, in the kitchen, moving slowly but purposefully as she prepared café con leche in the small aluminum pot that had been part of their family's possessions for as long as anyone could remember. The familiar aroma of strong coffee mixed with warm milk created an atmosphere of domestic normalcy that seemed almost surreal given the extraordinary events of the previous 12 hours. "Buenos dias, mija," Esperanza greeted Carmen quietly, her voice carrying the warmth that had always marked their morning interactions. "La niña is still sleeping?" Carmen nodded, accepting the small cup of coffee that her grandmother offered. The warm ceramic felt comforting against her palms, providing a moment of sensory grounding before the day's challenges began in earnest. "She needs the rest. I don't think she's slept safely in a very long time." Through the kitchen window, Detroit was beginning its daily transformation from the quiet emptiness of night to the gradual awakening of urban activity. School buses would soon begin their routes, carrying children to educational opportunities that Carmen had once taken for granted, but which now seemed like luxuries available only to families with sufficient stability and resources. "We need to figure out what to do about school," Carmen said, thinking aloud as she sipped her coffee. "Isabella can't miss too many days, but I can't leave Sofia alone with you, Abuela. It's too much responsibility if something goes wrong." Esperanza's expression reflected the frustration of someone who understood her limitations, but struggled to accept them. The strokes had robbed her of the confidence and capability that had once made her the anchor of their extended family, leaving her dependent on others for tasks she had previously handled with ease. "Maybe Isabella could stay home today," Esperanza suggested hesitantly. "Help me watch the little one while you work?" Carmen considered the proposal, weighing educational priorities against immediate childcare needs. Isabella's grades remained strong despite their family's upheaval, but missing school created ripple effects that could compound over time. Teachers asked questions about absences, guidance counselors initiated interventions for students who displayed irregular attendance. Patterns and academic momentum was difficult to maintain when learning was frequently interrupted. The sound of movement from the bedroom indicated that Sophia was beginning to stir, her internal clock responding to daylight despite her exhaustion. Carmen set down her coffee cup and moved toward the bedroom, knowing that the child's first moments of consciousness would be critical in establishing whether she felt safe or threatened in her new environment. Sophia sat up slowly in Isabella's bed, her blonde hair tangled and her eyes wide with the disorientation that often accompanied awakening in unfamiliar surroundings. For a moment, panic flickered across her features as she struggled to remember where she was and how she had arrived there. Carmen appeared in the doorway at exactly the right moment, her presence providing immediate reassurance. "Good morning, sweetheart," Carmen said gently, entering the room and sitting on the edge of the bed. You're safe. You're in Isabella's room, remember? You had some soup last night and met my grandmother. Recognition dawned gradually in Sophia's eyes, followed by something that might have been relief. She pulled the blankets closer around her small frame, creating a protective cocoon while she processed the reality of waking up in a warm, safe place rather than the cold, threatening environment she had apparently grown accustomed to expecting. "Is it real?" Sophia whispered, her voice still hoarse from the previous night's emotional release. "Are you really going to let me stay here?" The question revealed the depth of her psychological conditioning, the systematic erosion of trust that had convinced her that safety was temporary and kindness was always followed by betrayal. Carmen felt her heart contract at the realization that Sophia's captors had not only abused her physically, but had destroyed her ability to believe in the possibility of genuine protection. "It's real," Carmen assured her, reaching out slowly to smooth the child's tangled hair. "This is your home now, for as long as you need it to be. No one is going to hurt you here." Isabella appeared in the doorway, having awakened to the sound of quiet conversation. She carried a glass of orange juice and a piece of toast that she had prepared without being asked, demonstrating the kind of intuitive caregiving that had developed during their months of navigating family crisis together. "I thought you might be hungry," Isabella said, offering the simple breakfast to Sophia. "The orange juice is the good kind, not the cheap stuff. Carmen splurged on it yesterday." Sophia accepted the food with the same careful gratitude she had shown the previous evening, eating slowly and watching the faces of her caregivers for any sign that the kindness might be withdrawn. Carmen recognized that rebuilding trust would be a gradual process, requiring consistent demonstration that their family operated on different principles than the environment Sophia had escaped. The shrill ring of the telephone interrupted the quiet morning routine, causing Sophia to flinch visibly at the unexpected sound. Carmen hurried to answer before the noise could disturb their grandmother or create additional anxiety for their newest family member. "Hello," Carmen answered, expecting to hear Murphy's gruff voice inquiring about her absence from the morning shift. Instead, she heard an unfamiliar woman's voice, professional and carefully modulated in the way that suggested official business. "Is this Carmen Rodriguez?" Carmen's pulse immediately accelerated, her mind racing through possible explanations. For an unknown caller who knew her name. Had someone reported Sophia missing? Were social services conducting an investigation? Had Murphy decided to involve authorities despite his apparent support the previous evening? "Yes, this is Carmen," she replied carefully, moving to the kitchen, where she could speak without Sophia overhearing the conversation. "Ms. Rodriguez, my name is Detective Sarah Williams with the Detroit Police Department. I'm calling because we received information that you may have encountered a missing child last night. We'd like to ask you some questions." Carmen's knees felt weak as the implications of the call became clear. Someone had connected her family to Sophia's disappearance, triggering exactly the kind of official investigation that the child feared most. The careful balance they had established over the past 12 hours was about to be shattered by forces beyond their control. "What kind of information?" Carmen asked, stalling for time while her mind raced through possible responses and their likely consequences. "We have surveillance footage from a diner on 8 Mile Road showing you leaving the premises last night with 2 children, one of whom matches the description of a girl who was reported missing 3 days ago." "Detective," Williams explained. "Her name is Sophia Chen, and her parents have been searching for her since she disappeared from a park in Bloomfield Hills." The revelation hit Carmen like a physical blow. Sophia wasn't the victim of human trafficking that they had assumed. She was a missing child from an affluent suburb whose parents were undoubtedly desperate to find her. The story she had told about captivity and threats was either the product of trauma-induced confusion or deliberate deception designed to avoid being returned to her family. Carmen sank into one of their kitchen chairs, struggling to process information that completely reframed their understanding of the situation. Bloomfield Hills was one of Michigan's wealthiest communities, home to business executives and professionals whose lives bore no resemblance to the economic struggles that defined Carmen's daily existence. If Sophia belonged to such a family, her presence in a Detroit alley suggested circumstances far more complex than simple kidnapping. "Ms. Rodriguez, are you still there?" Detective Williams asked when Carmen failed to respond immediately. "Yes, I'm here," Carmen managed, her voice tight with conflicting emotions. Relief that Sophia wasn't the victim of trafficking warred with confusion about why the child had lied about her circumstances, and fear about what the revelation meant for their newly formed family bonds. "We need to arrange for Sophia's return to her parents as soon as possible," the detective continued. "They've been beside themselves with worry. Can you bring her to the station this morning?" Carmen looked through the kitchen doorway toward the bedroom where Sophia was finishing her toast, laughing quietly at something Isabella had said. The child's relaxed demeanor was such a contrast to the terrified girl they had found that the thought of disrupting her sense of safety felt almost cruel, regardless of the underlying truth about her identity. "Detective Williams," Carmen said, "carefully. The child seems to be afraid of police involvement. She mentioned threats and said she couldn't trust authorities. Maybe there's more to this situation than her parents realize." There was a pause before the detective responded, her tone becoming more professional and less conversational. "Ms. Rodriguez, I understand that you've formed an attachment to this child, but she belongs with her family. Her parents are respected members of the community, and there's no evidence of abuse or neglect in their home. Sometimes children run away for reasons that seem important to them but aren't actually dangerous." The explanation felt insufficient given the intensity of Sophia's fear and the specific nature of her claims about trafficking and corruption. Carmen found herself torn between accepting official assurances and trusting her own observations of the child's behavior and emotional state. "What if we brought her parents here instead?" Carmen suggested. "Let them see her in a safe environment before making any changes? She's just starting to feel secure, and I'm worried that another disruption might set back her recovery." Detective Williams' response carried a note of impatience that suggested she was accustomed to compliance rather than negotiation. "Ms. Rodriguez, I appreciate your concern, but this isn't a custody negotiation. Sophia Chen is a minor who belongs with her legal guardians. We need her returned to police custody so she can be properly reunited with her family." Carmen closed her eyes, understanding that the decision was being taken out of her hands regardless of her concerns about Sophia's welfare. The legal system operated according to rules that prioritized parental rights over the complex emotional bonds that had formed during crisis situations. Yet something about the detective's tone, the emphasis on the family's social standing, and the dismissal of Sophia's fears suggested that important details were being overlooked. "Can I have an hour to prepare her?" Carmen asked, accepting the inevitable while trying to minimize the trauma of transition. "She's been through a lot, and I want to help her understand what's happening." "1 hour," Detective Williams agreed. "We'll send a patrol car to pick her up at your address. Please have her ready to go." The line went dead, leaving Carmen staring at the silent phone while her mind raced through the implications of what was about to happen. In 60 minutes, Sophia would be removed from their home and returned to a family situation that might or might not be safe, despite the child's obvious terror at the prospect of such a reunion. Isabella appeared in the kitchen doorway, her expression alert and concerned. "Was that about Sophia?" Carmen nodded slowly, struggling to find words that would explain the situation without creating panic. The police found us. They say she belongs to a family in Bloomfield Hills who have been looking for her. But she said those people hurt her. Isabella protested, her voice rising with indignation. She said she couldn't trust the police because they had friends everywhere. I know, Carmen replied, pulling Isabella close and trying to project calm despite her own turmoil. But sometimes the situation is more complicated than it first appears. Maybe she was confused, or maybe she misunderstood what happened to her. Even as she spoke the words, Carmen felt doubt gnawing at her confidence. Sophia's fear had been too specific, too detailed, too visceral to be the product of simple confusion. Children who lied about abuse typically displayed different behavioral patterns than those who had genuinely experienced trauma, yet the official investigation suggested a straightforward case of a runaway child whose parents wanted her returned. Isabella's eyes filled with tears as the reality of losing their newest family member became clear. She's going to think we betrayed her. She's going to think we lied when we said she could stay with us forever. Carmen felt her own eyes begin to burn as she contemplated the conversation she would have to have with Sophia, the explanation that would shatter the trust they had worked so hard to build. In less than an hour, they would have to watch as police officers removed the child they had claimed as family, potentially returning her to circumstances that might be dangerous despite official assurances to the contrary. Carmen sat on the edge of Isabella's bed, watching Sophia's face as she carefully explained the phone call from Detective Williams. The child's expression transformed from confusion to betrayal, to absolute terror within the span of 30 seconds, her small hands gripping the blankets with white-knuckled intensity as the reality of the situation penetrated her consciousness. "No," Sophia whispered, shaking her head violently. "No, you don't understand. Those aren't my real parents. The people who took me, they made me practice calling them Mom and Dad. They said if I ever told anyone the truth, they would kill my real family." The words hit Carmen like ice water, instantly clarifying why Sophia's story had seemed both traumatic and contradictory. The child hadn't been lying about trafficking. She had been forced to assume a false identity as part of her captivity. The parents in Bloomfield Hills were likely her captors, using wealth and social standing to create a veneer of respectability that would discourage investigation. "Sophia, listen to me," Carmen said urgently, grasping the child's shoulders gently but firmly. "What's your real name? Where are your actual parents?" "Maya," Sophia whispered, tears streaming down her cheeks. "My name is Maya Rodriguez. My parents are looking for me in Texas. They don't know where I am." The shared surname struck Carmen like lightning. Rodriguez was common enough, but the coincidence felt significant, as if fate had guided this child to a family who would understand her heritage and protect her identity. Carmen's mind raced through the implications, understanding that they had perhaps 40 minutes before police arrived to take Maya to people who might be her traffickers. Isabella had been listening from the doorway, her young face pale with horror, as she absorbed the true scope of what was happening. "Carmen," she said quietly, "we can't let them take her. We can't." Carmen pulled out her cell phone with trembling fingers, knowing that she was about to make a decision that could destroy their family's stability, but understanding that some choices transcended personal cost. She dialed 911, her heart pounding, as she prepared to challenge the official narrative that Detective Williams had presented. 1. What's your emergency? My name is Carmen Rodriguez, and I have a child here who says she's being trafficked. Detective Williams from Detroit PD called about returning her to people she claims are her captors, not her parents. I need to speak with someone involved in human trafficking immediately. The dispatcher's tone became more focused. "Ma'am, can you repeat your address and stay on the line? I'm transferring you to Detective Morrison in our trafficking unit." Carmen rattled off their address while Isabella moved to comfort Maya, who was sobbing with the relief of finally being believed. Esperanza appeared in the doorway, her face etched with concern despite her limited understanding of the crisis. Unfolding around her, "Mija," Esperanza said quietly to Carmen, "whatever is happening, we protect the children first. Everything else we figure out later." Detective Morrison's voice came through the phone, steady and professional, but with an undertone of urgency that suggested he took trafficking allegations seriously. "Ms. Rodriguez, I need you to tell me exactly what this child has told you about her situation." Carmen recounted Maya's story, the false identity, the threats against her real family, the conditioning that had taught her to respond to the name Sophia Chen and claim wealthy suburban parents as her own. As she spoke, she could hear typing in the background, suggesting that Morrison was cross-referencing information in real time. "Ms. Rodriguez, we've been tracking a trafficking ring that specializes in creating false identities for victims," Morrison said after a long pause. "The Chen family has been on our radar for 6 months, but we haven't had enough evidence to move forward. If this child can provide testimony—" "She's 8 years old," Carmen interrupted. "She's been traumatized and terrorized. Whatever testimony she can provide, she needs protection first." "Understood. I'm sending a team to your location immediately. Do not allow Detective Williams or any other officers to remove the child until my people arrive. We believe Williams may be compromised." The revelation that Detective Williams might be corrupt confirmed Maya's fears about police involvement and vindicated Carmen's instinct to trust the child's terror over official assurances. Carmen ended the call and immediately began preparing for what might be a confrontation between different law enforcement factions, each claiming legitimate authority over Maya's custody. "Maya," Carmen said, kneeling beside the bed, "the good police are coming to help you, but we might have to wait a little while, and it might get scary. Do you trust me to keep you safe?" Maya nodded, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. "You believed me when nobody else would. You gave me a real family, even if it's just for a little while." Isabella sat on the bed and took Maya's hand. "It's not just for a little while. Carmen doesn't give up on people she cares about. She didn't give up on me when our parents died, and she won't give up on you." The sound of car doors slamming outside indicated that someone had arrived, potentially earlier than the 1 hour deadline Detective Williams had specified. Carmen moved to the window and peered through the curtains, seeing 2 patrol cars parked on the street with officers emerging, who didn't appear to be part of Morrison's trafficking unit. "They're here," Carmen announced, her voice tight with anxiety. "Maya, I need you to stay in this room no matter what happens. Okay? Isabella, stay with her." Carmen walked to the front door, her pulse thundering in her ears as she prepared to refuse an official police order based on nothing more than a child's word and her own intuition. Through the peephole, she could see Detective Williams approaching with 2 uniformed officers, their expressions suggesting they expected routine compliance with their instructions. The knock was firm, but not aggressive, carrying the authority of law enforcement conducting official business. Her men opened the door, but kept the security chain engaged, creating a barrier that would prevent immediate entry while allowing conversation. "Ms. Rodriguez, we're here to collect Sophia Chen," Detective Williams announced, her tone brooking. "No opposition. Please have her ready to go." "I'm sorry, Detective Williams, but I've spoken with Detective Morrison from the trafficking unit. He's asked me not to release the child until his team arrives." Williams' expression darkened immediately, confirming suspicions about her motivations. "Ms. Rodriguez, you're interfering with a police investigation. Step aside and produce the child immediately, or you'll be charged with obstruction." "Then you'll have to charge me," Carmen replied steadily, surprised by her own courage in the face of official intimidation. "Because I'm not turning over a traumatized child to people she's afraid of without proper verification." The standoff continued for several tense minutes, with Williams making increasingly aggressive demands, while Carmen maintained her position behind the chained door. Finally, the sound of additional vehicles arriving broke the tension, as Detective Morrison's team appeared with the kind of tactical equipment that suggested they were prepared for resistance. Morrison himself approached the door, badge prominently displayed, his demeanor professional but reassuring. "Ms. Rodriguez, I'm Detective Morrison. Thank you for protecting this child and calling our unit." The jurisdictional dispute that followed played out largely beyond Carmen's understanding, involving radio communications, supervisor consultations, and what appeared to be the arrest of Detective Williams for corruption charges that had apparently been pending for months. Carmen watched through her window as Williams was placed in handcuffs and led to an unmarked vehicle, her fall from authority as swift as it was dramatic. "It's safe now," Morrison announced when the corrupt officers had been removed. "We'd like to speak with Maya about her experiences, but we understand she's been through trauma. We'll bring in specialists trained to work with trafficking victims." The next several hours passed in a blur of interviews, medical examinations, and paperwork that gradually established Maya's true identity and began the process of locating her real family in Texas. Child psychologists worked gently with her to document her experiences while respecting her emotional fragility, creating evidence that would eventually dismantle the trafficking network that had destroyed so many young lives. Carmen, Isabella, and Esperanza were questioned extensively about their actions, but it quickly became clear that they were viewed as heroes rather than suspects. The trafficking unit had been building a case against the Chen family for months, and Maya's testimony provided the breakthrough they needed to obtain search warrants and make arrests. As evening approached, Carmen received a phone call that would change everything. Maya's real parents, Maria and Jose Rodriguez from San Antonio, had been contacted and were flying to Detroit immediately. But more than that, they had been searching for their daughter for 18 months, ever since she had been abducted from a shopping mall parking lot while visiting relatives in Michigan. "Ms. Rodriguez," Detective Morrison said as he prepared to leave, "what you did today, trusting that child's word over official authority, protecting her when it would have been easier to comply, you saved her life. The Chen family was planning to move her out of state tomorrow. We might never have found her." Carmen felt tears welling up as the magnitude of what had transpired began to sink in. Maya was safe, the trafficking ring was being dismantled, and corrupt officials were being held accountable. But more than that, their small family had proven that ordinary people could make extraordinary differences when they chose courage over convenience. When Maya's real parents arrived the next morning, the reunion was everything that the previous day's threatened handover had not been. Genuine tears of joy, desperate embraces, and the unmistakable recognition between people who truly belonged together. Maria Rodriguez wept as she held her daughter, whispering prayers of gratitude in Spanish, while Jose thanked Carmen repeatedly for keeping Maya safe. "We can never repay you," Maria said through her tears. "You gave us back our child, our hope, our future." But the gratitude flowed both ways. Maya's parents, learning about the Rodriguez family's circumstances, insisted on providing support that would transform their economic situation. Jose owned a successful construction company in San Antonio and offered Carmen a management position that would triple her income, while allowing her to complete her college education through company-sponsored programs. "Maya has told us how you made her feel like family," Maria explained. "Now we want to make that permanent. We want you to be part of our extended family, to share in our blessings the way you shared your home when we couldn't." The offer seemed too good to be true, but it was presented with the sincerity of people who understood that their daughter's rescue was worth any sacrifice. Carmen found herself accepting not just employment, but adoption into a network of support that would ensure Isabella's educational opportunities, Esperanza's medical care, and their family's long-term stability. 6 months later, Carmen stood behind the counter of Rodriguez Family Community Center, a non-profit organization funded by Maya's parents and dedicated to helping trafficking victims and at-risk children. Isabella attended a private school where her artistic talents were nurtured through specialized programs, while Esperanza received excellent medical care that had significantly improved her cognitive function. Maya visited frequently from San Antonio, her trauma healing gradually through therapy and the security of being restored to her real family. She and Isabella had maintained their sisterly bond, corresponding regularly and planning summer visits that reinforced the connection forged during those crucial hours of crisis. Murphy's Corner Diner still served its community, but now it participated in a network of safe havens where vulnerable people could find help and protection. Murphy himself had been moved by the story's outcome, installing better security systems and training his staff to recognize signs of trafficking and abuse. The transformation extended beyond individual lives to systemic change. The corruption investigation sparked by Maya's case led to reforms in missing persons procedures and better coordination between different law enforcement agencies. Carmen's story became a training case study, demonstrating how ordinary citizens could play crucial roles in protecting vulnerable populations. But perhaps most importantly, 3 generations of Rodriguez women had learned that family was defined not by surnames or genetics, but by the willingness to protect, nurture, and sacrifice for those who needed love most desperately. In saving Maya, they had saved themselves, discovering reserves of strength and compassion that transformed their understanding of what was possible when people chose to act with courage rather than convenience. As Carmen watched children play in the center's safe playground, she often reflected on that October night when a frightened child had appeared in an alley behind a struggling diner. The decision to help had seemed small at the time, motivated by basic human decency rather than any expectation of reward. Yet that choice had rippled outward, touching dozens of lives and creating changes that would extend far beyond their individual circumstances. In the end, the story wasn't really about one waitress helping one lost girl. It was about the power of ordinary people to create extraordinary change when they refused to look away from suffering, when they chose compassion over comfort, and when they trusted that doing the right thing would somehow lead to outcomes better than they could have imagined. Maya had found her way home, but in the process, she had shown the Rodriguez family that home was anywhere people chose to love and protect each other unconditionally. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.